We're
Pronounce
going
your
live, Deborah.
okay,
We're
cool.
live.
All right, cool. Everyone, welcome to a holiday version of Access Chat. We are very excited to speak to Charlotte today, and Charlotte's with the World Bank. And Neil is heading off to Miami, so he won't be joining the interview today. But Charlotte, do you mind starting by introducing yourself to the audience and letting them know a little bit about your background?
Great. Thank you, Deborah. It's lovely to be with you today and happy holidays to all of those connected. My name is Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo, not the easiest name to pronounce. Um, and I am a global disability advisor to the World Bank Group. By training, I am a lawyer. I focused and studied primarily human rights law. Previous to this position at the World Bank, I worked as the coordinator for disability inclusive development at USAID. I've worked in the space of development for at least the last 15 years. And previous to that, I was on the South African Human Rights Commissioner, where I too there worked on issues related to the rights of persons with disabilities. I think one of the most interesting parts of my career has been being very involved in the negotiations around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I was part of the South African delegation as an advisor to that process. And then I was the representative of national human rights institutions for a little while. And then later came back as an observer of the World Bank. And so watched the entire negotiation around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then in post positions, I've been able to look at how implementation is taking shape.
Yes, I've been tracking your work, Charlotte, and I've always been so impressed with what you're achieving.
Thank
And
you.
so, where were you born?
So I was born in a very tiny country called Swaziland, which is in southern Africa, which is a landlocked country surrounded by South Africa. I come from a mixed parentage. My father is American. He comes from the Midwest, from Indiana. And my mother comes from South Africa, from one of the provinces, which is called the Eastern Cape.
Yes, I have always admired what you're bringing to the table, and I love that you're a human rights lawyer. And you
Well,
also,
I think
go
with a
ahead.
background like that, you kind of that kind of becomes part of who you are. So, the notions of social justice and inclusion were very much part of how I grew up.
Yeah, and I think I know that you're a global leader in this space and that you have worked with USAID and the World Bank and others, making sure that everyone is included. So why is that important besides the obvious to you, Charlotte? I mean, it's
Well,
important
I
to
mean,
all
I
of us.
think, I think there are a number of reasons why it's important. And, I will start off with the one that perhaps makes a lot of sense in the sense of just sheer number. If we look at the global population, we know that 15% of the world's population have some kind of a disability. And I think those estimates are also probably fairly conservative, because I think those estimates pick up on disabilities that we can name, that we can call, that we have diagnosed. But I think that there are many disabilities, particularly in the developing world, that we just haven't started to get our heads around or to be able to include them in terms of the numbers. So we're not collecting the data as we should. So we really, really don't know. I think this is particularly the case if we think about people with intellectual disabilities, if we think about the whole range of invisible disabilities that are prevalent in many of the developing world, but are just not being captured. And so 15% is a large number. It makes it the largest minority group. But I think we need to think about 15% as not being in stone. It's not a number built, carved in stone, because 15% means each one of those people is associated and part of a family, who's part of a society, who's part of community. So there's a ripple effect in terms of, what it means to have a disability. Um, within within every community. The other thing I think that it's important to respond to your question, Deborah, is that you know, we now have a legally binding document, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it bestows it gives and recognizes the rights of persons with disabilities. So, like all other humans, we have rights, and now we have a convention that fortifies those rights, and presents them as a set of holistic rights for us to enjoy. And then I think, the other argument that's worth making is that it makes economic sense. If you don't include large populations, you're leaving them out. And increasingly, the research is telling us that people with disabilities have disposable income. And given an opportunity, they can be part of markets, should be part of markets, and also, most importantly, can contribute to markets. So I think we need to think about it in that sense. What is it that people bring to the table? And in that regard, I'm not just talking about what it is that you bring for economic purposes, but I think it's also thinking about how do we celebrate and recognize our diversity. And for me, this is a really important piece. And so, I think there really is an important need for us, when we think about diversity, to really drill down and think about who we're talking about. Because I think too often we just break diversity down into groups that we're comfortable with, that we've agreed upon, but we're really not looking at what diversity means in its broadest sense. And then I would even drill down further, and maybe it's a challenge to the disability movement to look at how we ensure that those with disabilities that are typically absent from discussions. So again, people with intellectual disabilities, how do we ensure that they're part of the discussion? How do we ensure people who are deaf blind are part of the discussions? And so I think that really looking at full representation and ensuring that everybody gets a voice is really, really important.
I agree. Antonio, I know you had a question.
No, I'm usually between Portugal and Ireland, and two countries who have different approach to rights of people with disabilities. Especially how you see people with different communities talking and having a voice in society. See, how do you see the importance of the chart for people with disabilities being implemented when we live in the world that in the area of governments, there's always the tendency to not there's not enough money. It's difficult to find budgets to implement things. How do you see what challenges do we have in order to implement the rights for people with disabilities?
So, Antonio, I think the issue around the budget is often one that we hear. And I think, we should be at a stage where saying we don't have the budget is not good enough of an answer. I feel like that's something that's been thrown around for too long. And I feel that, whenever there's a budget crunch, it's always issues like disability that gets pushed to the side, or we only deal with disability when we have additional, surplus funds. Um, but if we can agree, like the Sustainable Development Goals have agreed, that it's an integral part of our development, and if we can recognize and implement the fact that the CRPD gives us those rights, right, entrenches those rights, then we don't have that wiggle room to say, well, we'll do this if we have, additional resources, or, we can't do this now because we haven't planned for it. My argument is that good planning includes everybody. And so good planning means thinking about how you get all children to school, including children with disabilities. And that at that time, you already start thinking about what your budget should be, and not coming back a couple of years later or a couple of months later to retrofit and then looking for additional funds. So I think that if we were more successful in ensuring that people with disabilities and the disability issue is part of the development discussion and agenda from the get-go, I think we would then be able to fold it in to the way we do business, right? It would become an integral, and should become an integral part of what we do. And I think it's just, I think, you know, continuously saying, well, we don't have the resources is not good enough. We've heard that in many places for many, many years. And, you know, I think my sense is that people with disabilities are getting rather impatient in that regard.
No, on AXSchat, we have interviewed people from different areas and different countries. And sometimes what we observe is different communities, they tend to speak within in each other. So the blind community, they speak within their own group. And the same happens with other groups. And sometimes it's difficult to have all these communities in the disability space to communicate together and act together. How do you see what can be done to change that way? Because if you are able to work together and join the different communities, we have a stronger voice.
Yes, and I think that's a really good question. And I often hear that from the receiving end. So I often hear that from people that I work with. They say, well, you know, we've been talking to people from the disability sector, but we can't seem to figure out whether we should be going with what the Organization of the Blind should be saying, or the Organization of the Deaf. And so if you don't know anything about disability, it's very confusing. I think that what makes me very excited is that increasingly, and in part because of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the process around its negotiation, that we're beginning to see, certainly at an international level and at a regional level, we're beginning to see very positive coalitions made up of cross-disabilities, where people have recognized that it is absolutely imperative that we around certain principles. I think we have to recognize that in the actual drill down and the expertise, it will be nuanced, right? So there are issues that relate to teaching children who are deaf that are very specific, and that kind of technical expertise resides with people who understand that, right? But the common issue for me is that those children have a right to education, and in education projects, I should find hooks to ensure that they have education. So I think it's really important that having one voice, and as I said, I think there has been great steps in this regard. I think the International Disability Alliance certainly is one of the spaces where we're beginning to hear a collective cross-disability and focusing on issues and not so much on the particular disability. We're seeing that increasingly at regional level with the various disability fora that have been set up. But I think we need to see a lot more of that at national level. And I feel that it's still, and you still have the traditional disability groups not really talking to each other in the way that I think would be beneficial for the macro of the and meeting the sustainable goals.
Charlotte, I know that you're in such a unique position. You happen to be a wheelchair user yourself. You are an attorney. You are a global leader. You have been, very active with the convention. You've been with USAID and now World Bank. And so, tell us more about. And I will tell you, Charlotte. Sometimes when I talk about World Bank, people think the World Bank is actually a bank. And so tell us more about the World Bank and the efforts you and your team are making at the World Bank to really help with, all these moving parts, because there's a lot of different moving parts in this conversation.
Yes. So, You're choppy, but I think I have the gist of the question.
Sorry.
So I there are lots of moving parts, and indeed there are a lot of moving parts. So wanted to be known that the the work of disability at the World Bank is not new. So Harvard was being time at the bank, and I do like to give recognition to those in the past that have led this effort. So I mean, I would say that for at least 30 years, the bank has engaged at some level on the issue of disability. If you look at archives and their and these around disability. But I think that it was very much during the Wolfenson years that the issue of disability and development really began as an important area of bank's work. And I think at that time it was also really important that Judith Heumann was brought on as the first advisor to the World Bank. And I think under Judith's leadership, the bank began to really start to think about what this means. What does disability inclusion mean within the context of development? And it was that year, I think it was 2004, that the first kind of big global international conference on disability and development took place. It took place in Washington, D.C. It brought in many of the key stakeholders. And it was really the beginning of kind of a serious discussion about what this meant for development. What would disability inclusive development look like? And so I think that that conference was really kind of instrumental and played a pivotal role in terms of getting us to think about it and then design projects to support that. I mean, since 2004, and then with the CRPD coming into force, the disability inclusive development has really taken shape in many different places and not just the World Bank. So as you rightly pointed out, USAID is as far as I know, the first bilateral donor to ever have a policy on disability inclusion, and that dates back to 1998. So USAID was ahead of its time in that regard. Today, I would say that most bilateral donors now have some kind of a policy, some form of a directive, or a strategy that guides their institution, their agency, on how they will address the issue of disability within development. At the World Bank, we have a number of different types of entry points for disability inclusion, and I hope this gets to answering your question. The one is to ensure that disability is included in our analytics and diagnostics that the bank undertakes. So in that regard, really looking at boosting the research to be more inclusive, looking at various opportunities amongst the various instruments that we have, looking at survey tools to collect better data on disability, looking at the various analyses we do, and within that, look to ensure that disability is included. The other area that's really important, as an important hook for disability inclusion, is to look at the bank operations. So we run a lot of operations at country level. And within those operations, we have projects. And those projects are in collaboration with national governments. And therein, it becomes really important for us to find, entry points for disability inclusion. And there are many. And they straddle across the sectors of the bank's work. So for instance, if you look at a transportation project, we can now say that there are a suite of transportation projects that include the issue around universal design and universal access for persons with disabilities. Are we at 100%? No, we're not at 100%. That is my work to try to get us to that stage where it becomes the norm, where it becomes just the good design. In the education sector, we have education projects that are including children with disabilities, that are training teachers on inclusive education. Is it every single project? No. Should it be every single project? Yes. We need to get there. It's very much a process. So the idea there is to provide for my team, which is a very small team, to provide technical assistance to bank staff on how they may include persons with disabilities or disability related issues into the programs and projects that they're working on. The other important piece from where I sit, kind of bringing these moving parts together, is the need to build partnerships, because we're very aware that we can't do everything as the bank, and even less so as a very small cohort of people within the bank that are working specifically on disability. So how do we work with other groups, and how do we work with the wealth of information and the numerous experts that exist outside of the bank? And so to that end, I've been working to forge partnerships with academics, with think tanks, with the cutting edge experts, so that we can begin to work together with organizations that are already championing this work and have been doing so in some instances for 60 years. So we're, we're really also looking outside of the bank for the expertise. Because what I've found over the years is that we're at a stage today that people are not we're not getting blowback on why we should include persons with disabilities. Where we see some kind of reluctance is around how do we get this going, and not just how do we get this going, by way of a pilot, but how do we get this going to scale? How do we make sure that we move from pilot to project? So if we're running an education project in country X, we don't want to have a tiny little pilot project that's looking at the inclusion of children with disabilities. We want to make sure that it's running the full gamut of the education project that we're running nationally. So those, to me, are some of the things that we're focusing on to try to bring all of these moving parts together in a more coherent and cohesive manner.
So, how important it is to find the right allies in the developing of your projects?
So that is absolutely essential. I think when I think back at projects that have been successful, they've almost always been ignited by an ally or supported by an ally. And that's great. It's really important. It's good to have somebody who believes that this can work, who supports to make it work, who champions it. And so allies are really important. And allies are important inside of the bank. They're also important outside of the bank. But in many ways, I want to get to the stage where we get past the allies, in the sense that I want it not just to be dependent on whether one or two people think it's a good idea or that they understand the value. But I want it to get to a stage where development workers see it as an integral piece of the development agenda, and that you do it because it's good development and not because you have a brother with a disability or a son with a disability. I think, we have to find a way to move it up, so that, again, it just becomes a part of good practice.
That is an excellent point, Charlotte, because I'm a parent of a child, well, an adult woman now with disabilities. And so it's clear why I'm passionate about it. But I just think that's such a good point that you made. And so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And tomorrow we are going to be fortunate to have you joining us as our featured guest on AXSchat. And I hope that people will, follow you on Twitter and Facebook and others, and I know that you speak all over the world about these topics, and you are, in my eyes, one of the most brilliant women in the space. And so we're very honored to have you on Access Chat, Charlotte.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you so much for the opportunity. And, you know, I think for me, one of the most important pieces around this is that none of us have all the answers. So I'm excited about this discussion. I think, you know, it's about learning, it's about sharing, it's about very much listening. So I welcome, you know, the positive thinking that can come from this. And I think that, you know, we all bring to the table some really fascinating insight. And what really makes me excited about the work that I do is that I'm learning every day. I'm learning new things. I'm speaking to new people. And I think that, you know, this is an excellent opportunity for us to continue to do that. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yes, we're very proud of Access Chat because we feel that we've brought in community members that weren't maybe in the conversation before. So that's why we love featuring leaders like you, Charlotte, and I know Antonio and I are very grateful for you being on the program, and so is Neil.
Thank you, Charlotte. It was a pleasure to have you with us.
Yes, it's a good way to celebrate the holidays. So thank you so much, Charlotte. And we'll talk to everybody later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.